Miss Radioactive, the ferocious radioactive queen whose exploits across the world earned her the title of Queen of Terror. She aptly lived up to this title by bringing the entire planet to its knees using her devastating radioactive power and coming to rule over all life on the planet, making them suffer as she had to during her hellish years in the Chernobyl exclusion zone. Put her against the Jujutsu world, a cutthroat conservative society focused around the usage of cursed energy and sorcery to further their own desires and keep the general public safe from dangerous and horrific cursed spirits, beings manifested from negative energy of humans who want nothing more than to inconvenience and destroy the humans who make them be. Being home to dangerous, centuries-old cursed spirits, cursed users, and powerful sorcerers capable of transcending the concept of time and age and destroying the world as we know it, who would come out on top? If Miss Radioactive were dropped into the world of Jujutsu Kaisen as a curse user, who would emerge victorious? The Radioactive Queen subjecting human and curses alike to her terror, or would the Jujutsu world come together and prevail, exercising the Queen as they would any other curse user who abandons Jujutsu society? Today, this question will be answered. In this video, we'll be putting Miss Radioactive from the Radioactive Queen duology against the forces of Jujutsu Kaisen. I've wanted to cover this for a while, and when I started researching it, I realized it was actually way more interesting than I first thought. To be completely honest, when the thought came into my head, I just thought Miss Radioactive would get cooked instantly, but as we'll see, and as the title kind of spoils, that's not necessarily the case. As will become evident, major spoilers for both Radioactive Queen and the Jujutsu Kaisen manga lie ahead. If you're still here, I'll assume you either don't care about spoilers for either series, or you're caught up with both. With that out of the way, let's jump right into this. Start off, we're gonna need to get a good feel on what both verses have to work with and what they're both capable of. Since we're putting one woman up against an entire fictional universe, I feel like it's more convenient and fair to lay out Miss Radioactive's kit first. Her main kit consists of 3 abilities: her pink radiation, which she controls and generates from her hands, her ability to teleport anywhere instantaneously, and her ability to hypnotize people. Starting with her titular radiation, the radiation is so powerful that it can melt buildings down to their very core, as well as being so bright and hot that it can instantly and permanently blind somebody for looking at it for less than a second. It also can create 3 subset abilities, the first being the generation of slime-like creatures from the pink radiation, which grow stronger with the more blood they consume. This should mean that in a Gauntlet-style matchup, the more times Miss Radioactive wins, the stronger she gets. The second subset ability used by her pink radiation is the generation of radioactive shields. In Radioactive Queen 2, it's stated that she can cover herself in her pink radiation to protect her from oncoming attacks such as missiles and bullets, as her radiation is so hot and acidic that it would instantly burn through any of those things. Due to its brightness, it would also make her really hard to fight, seeing as it could just blind anyone who sees it. The third subset ability, which isn't technically an ability, it's more just a consequence of her powers being radiation, but she can mess with electronics and technology through the use of electromagnetic pulses, as electromagnetic waves are essentially just radiation in and of themselves, and she reigns supreme over radiation, allowing her to stop cars dead in their tracks and disable high-powered military equipment like planes, tanks, and jets. Her second main ability, instant teleportation, is exactly that. She can teleport wherever and whenever she wants to. In the scenario, this is emphasized by her traveling instantaneously to multiple major cities across the United States before swapping over to teleporting to countries whole oceans away in the second scenario. Her third ability is the ability to hypnotize people. The way this hypnosis works isn't exactly stated nor set in stone. It's generally implied that a person has to submit to Miss Radioactive first before falling victim to her hypnosis. However, because somebody has to already be defeated or submit to Miss Radioactive it won't be of any use during the fight since they would not be actively submitting to her nor beaten enough to want to submit, so it's not really going to come into play here. Now that we've got her kit covered, we can move on to her actual scaling and see just how much of a punch she can pack, starting with her attack potency. From the start, she shows large building to large city level feats, as her radiation is described in multiple alerts to be so hot and acidic that it can melt buildings down to their core, as stated in the power section. Her entire MO across both scenarios is teleporting across multiple major cities of the US and completely burning them to the ground, which would quite comfortably put her in the large city levels of AP. This seems to be the most consistently shown level, however, it's not necessarily her max. In the scenario, it's stated that she can use nuclear power plants as well as nuclear weapons to overcharge her radiation and make it stronger, as well as use them as mediums to spread her radiation. If you believe this to be indicative of her AP, this would quite comfortably put her in the small country level, as when she destroyed the Catawba and McGuire nuclear power plants, they generated enough radiation to cover a 300-mile circular radius, which engulfed most states across the East Coast, quite comfortably putting her in small to regular country level. Due to the fact that a feat like this requires her to use nuclear power plants as mediums, it can be argued that this isn't her actual AP since she can't do it on her own. However, the small country level AP feats do get substantiated later in the scenarios, as in Radioactive Queen 2, it's stated in an alert that she burned the entirety of North Carolina to the ground and covered it in her pink radiation. This destruction feat is purely done by Miss Radioactive herself, so I think it's a valid feat. Seeing as North Carolina is almost as big as the island of Great Britain, this would quite comfortably put her in large island to small country level. From here, her city to country level scaling remains pretty consistent. However, if you want to highball her, there's a feat in Radioactive Queen 1 that suggests that her destructive capability is far greater than even this. During her destruction of LA, it stated that she was able to completely deplete the ozone layer over the city of LA, subjecting any survivors to deadly ionizing UV radiation. According to some rough, and I mean very rough calculations, completely depleting the ozone layer in a size equivalent to the city of LA would require roughly an exajoule of energy. An exajoule of energy is roughly equal to about 10 to the 18th power in joules, which would quite comfortably put her in the multi-continental tier. Granted, this math is not the best. Due to this, I'll leave it up to viewer interpretation as to whether you believe she actually reaches this tier of AP. If you are a power scaler or just like to do calculations like these, please correct me in the comments if I'm wrong, since I like to have a better grasp of her AP. I'm not intentionally trying to highball her, I'm just pretty bad at math. Regardless of the actual validity of this feat, it will be taken into consideration as an absolute highball. As later in the scenario, if you believe that her using things as mediums count towards her AP, her multi-continental level gets substantiated, as she hijacks the nuclear arsenals of the 7 nuclear powers of the world and uses them to launch her radiation across the world, covering the entire planet in pink radiation. A feat like this would obviously be multi-continental, perhaps even planetary, since it covered the entire world. However, again, this is if you believe that her using things as mediums counts towards her AP. If you don't, then this feat can be ignored. Moving on to speed, likewise we have a few different interpretations. The most canonical one is that she just has irrelevant speed due to being able to teleport. Her teleportation is stated and shown to be instant, and as said before, she can appear anywhere in the world she wants. I don't think this is very fun, however, since she would just speed blitz anything and anyone who gets in her way, so I'm going to propose 2 different lines of scaling. The first is that her travel just appears to be instantaneous. Now, in order to travel across the world and appear as if you're doing so instantaneously, you need to be either relativistic or faster than light, as light itself can travel the Earth 7 times in a single second. Miss Radioactive can travel the world instantly. So it would be a fair assumption to say that if it isn't actually just instant teleportation and she's just moving so fast, then she would be within the relativistic to massively faster than light tier. The third interpretation is admittedly more of a low ball, and that's by just assuming that she isn't actually instantaneously fast, she's just faster than anything humanity can throw at her. This means she would scale above weapons like the Cirruscon cruise missile or ICBMs, which have speeds of Mach 9 and Mach 24 respectively, putting her comfortably into the hypersonic plus tier for a low ball and bordering on high hypersonic. Personally, I believe all three of these interpretations are equally valid, so all three of them will be put into consideration during the versus battles. Moving on to her durability, we can apply the same three lines of reasoning. If we take the canonical material, she's outright stated to be invincible, so her durability just doesn't matter, as she wouldn't be able to be killed with any physical attacks short of outright existence erasure or spatial erasure. For a more fair interpretation of her durability, you can just say that whatever she can output, she can withstand as well. And since her AP can range from large city to multi-continental, this should also be where her durability lies. The third interpretation involves the same line of logic as the speed scaling, that being she's stronger than anything humanity can throw at her. This means she should scale above weapons like the Tsar Bomba, which had a blast yield of almost 60 megatons of TNT, putting her pretty solidly at large city level durability, which is consistent with her AP. If we consider the original build of the Tsar Bomba, that being 100 megatons of TNT, this would shoot her durability up to mountain level, which again is pretty consistent seeing as her AP can range anywhere from large city to multi-continental. Due to the various levels of scaling that Miss Radioactive could reach, and all of them being relatively reasonable and valid, I'm going to propose three different categories for Miss Radioactive, the first being the lowball category. In the lowball category, we'll be giving her large city level AP and durability with hypersonic to high hypersonic combat and reaction speed, potentially even getting up to massively hypersonic. For her consistent tier, we'll be giving her large island to country level AP, with her durability being the same. Her speed would range from sub-relativistic to relativistic plus as a highball. For the actual highball tier, we'll be giving her multi-continental AP and durability with FTL combat and reaction speed. Moving over to Jujutsu Kaisen, the powers of the verse vary wildly due to the nature of its power system. The Jujutsu world relies on cursed energy to fuel cursed techniques, which for the most part are either specific to the individual or inherited from bloodlines. Because of this, important cursed techniques will be covered when they come up with the specific characters who wield them. For this section, I'll just be going over some fundamentals that are likely going to show up in every versus battle. To explain what cursed energy and cursed techniques are, cursed energy is essentially negative energy generated from the negative emotions of human beings. Cursed techniques are the specific ways a sorcerer can manifest their cursed energy as. There are also 4 other fundamentals of the power system that sorcerers can make use of. The first, and arguably most important for these versus battles, is that of barrier techniques. Barrier techniques are exactly what they sound like, using cursed energy to encompass something in a barrier. The most potent of these barrier techniques, often considered to be the apex of Jujutsu sorcery, is that of a domain expansion. Domain expansions are essentially barriers that allow the effects of your cursed technique to always hit the target caught within it. This is known as the domain sure hit. Due to this sure hit nature, domain expansions can also neutralize the curse technique of a target, which may be protecting them from the sure hit. So say they had an invisible barrier that makes any attack stop before it hits them, the domain expansion just neutralizes it and goes right through it. The 2 other important barrier techniques that will factor in the most in these versus battles are that of simple domain and domain amplification. Simple domain involves opening a small domain around yourself that can protect you from sure hits. In the case of certain simple domains, it can also allow you to instantly counter or attack anyone who enters the range of the simple domain. Domain amplification, on the other hand, envelops your entire body in an empty domain, which is just a domain without a sure hit. This allows the user to resist the sure hit of any domain expansion they're caught within, as when two domains clash, their sure hits cancel out. When used outside of a domain, it can also neutralize the curse technique of anyone it's targeting, as domain amplification is technically an open domain, and thus would neutralize a curse technique. Moving on to the second fundamental, that being binding vows, these are essentially agreements made between two sorcerers or the Jujutsu world, in which one party agrees to or gives up something in order to gain something in return. They're often used to boost power, mainly in self-sacrificing binding vows, such as telling an opponent how your curse technique works. This puts you at a disadvantage because it gives the enemy the ability to think of workarounds to your curse technique. However, because you're disadvantaged by this, the binding vow boosts your curse technique's attack potency. Domains also utilize a binding vow, that being the actual barrier that encompasses the domain expansion. The outside of the domain is very weak to attacks and can be easily damaged by just punching it a few times. This, however, is offset by the fact that the interior of the domain is nigh impenetrable. In the series, a domain's barrier has never been broken from the inside, only from the outside. This is mostly done because in most one-on-one battles, you won't have anyone to get you out of a domain, and thus the risk of the domain's barrier being broken from the outside is next to zero. The third fundamental technique that will come up in this video is that of reverse curse technique. As stated, curse energy is just negative energy. Negative energy times negative energy is positive energy, just like a negative number times a negative number makes a positive number. Positive energy can be used to neutralize curses instantaneously or to regenerate from damage. In the case of these versus battles, that's going to be the only relevant part. Finally, we get to the fourth fundamental, that being the black flash. It's not really agreed upon as to what a black flash actually is. It's mostly described as lining up your cursed energy with a physical attack within 1/1 trillionth of a second, though as we see in the series, this isn't always the case. No sorcerer can hit these at will, although other sorcerers can make it appear as if they are, such as Yuji Itadori, who when he gets locked in, it seems like he's using black flashes whenever he wants to. When a black flash is landed, it dramatically increases the power of the attack, as well as afterward putting the sorcerer in a sort of flow state, or in which manipulating cursed energy becomes second nature to them, almost as easy as breathing. This allows sorcerers to operate at 120% of their potential. With the general powers out of the way, we can move on to the versus attack potency, which, like the Radioactive Queen, varies wildly depending on what statements you use. Some early feats make it seem like being able to destroy reinforced concrete is an impressive thing to do, and knocking someone through a few buildings is an unprecedented level of strength. But you also later on have people capable of creating actual black holes that can destroy the entire planet, as well as imaginary mass that can erase anything from existence. The most agreed upon and consistent ceilings for the verse we see are about large city to mountain and island level, as mid-tier characters such as Jogo are capable of completely destroying multiple city blocks with their strongest attacks. Characters above Jogo, such as 15-Finger Sukuna, are capable of casually smacking someone across multiple city blocks. Moving on to speed, we have a similar situation where small feats are generally considered to be impressive, meanwhile later, much larger feats casually outdo them and make them inconsistent. One glaring example of this is the battle between Maki and Cursed Spirit Naobito in Sakurajima Colony. In this battle, Maki gets completely blitzed and put out by an attack that goes at Mach 3. The narration emphasizes this to be considerably strong for the verse and some of the fastest speeds ever. However, Maki, earlier on in the series when she was much weaker than in Sakurajima Colony, was casually catching bullets at point blank. Calculations of this feat imply that at bare minimum, Maki would need about Mach 9 levels of reaction speed, while other calculations and estimates put it as high as Mach 16 or Mach 24, meaning that this bullet catching feat should be far more impressive than Naobito's Mach 3 feat. We see this hypersonic tier of reaction speed be substantiated in another earlier arc of the series, that being the Shibuya arc, wherein which Toji, a character comparable to a fully awakened Maki, who is stronger than the Maki that caught that bullet, is able to react to a lightning attack from the Shikigami Nue, although he's not able to outright dodge it. Later on in the Culling games, Maki, when being fully awakened and on par with Toji, is also able to react to a lightning attack from a stronger version of Nue after Sukuna takes over Megumi's body, which should give both of them at bare minimum massively hypersonic reaction speed. Other characters who are comparable to Maki, such as Hikari, are also able to react to lightning attacks, as during Hikari's fight with Kashimo, he gets a bolt of lightning shot at his head, yet moves out of his way to get his arm snatched off instead of his head. The smallest calculations for this feat I've seen are Mach 16 reaction speeds, which would be consistent with the bullet catching feat and also be much faster than the Mach 3 feat, which again puts Hikari's reaction speed at hypersonic. Higher and honestly more fair estimates, seeing as this is lightning we're talking about, put this feat in the triple digits of Mach speed, which would put Hikari's reaction speed at massively hypersonic. This hypersonic tier is generally shown to be more consistent than the Mach 3 tier, as Maki and Yuji are able to keep up with a 15-finger Sukuna. Meanwhile, a fully reincarnated Sukuna is able to move so fast that it looks like he completely disappeared when being shot at with a Mach 1 attack. A feat like this has also been calculated to be within the triple digits in terms of Mach speed, which would also put him at hypersonic plus to massively hypersonic. All this is to say that I don't really agree with that Mach 3 feat. It's generally more consistent that later in the series, characters are well into the hypersonic tier, with many of the high tiers being almost or actual lightning timers. The author of the series, Gege Akutami himself, kinda disavows this feat, by saying it doesn't make much sense that Mach 3 is considered an impressive feat when characters like Gojo are implied to have infinite or instantaneous speeds. Such impressive speed was demonstrated in his fight against Sukuna, where he was moving so fast he was able to create after images to fool Sukuna, which is a feat that has been calculated to require relativistic to FTL speeds. Later in the Shinjuku Showdown, a weaker version of Sukuna aim dodges an EM wave attack from Kashimo, which would also require sub to relativistic plus levels of reaction speed. Do I agree that JJK is light speed? Not really. I think the verse caps out at being lightning timers. That's the most consistent thing shown. However, light speed JJK will be given some consideration as a highball. Moving on to durability, there isn't really much to be said. Generally, whatever a character outputs, they should be able to withstand, just like with Miss Radioactive. The only thing I want to talk about here is the feat of Kenjaku surviving Yuki's black hole. People use this to say that Kenjaku has planetary levels of durability, as he's able to come out of a literal black hole, only having his clothes ripped off and being scratched up a lot. People who claim this don't seem to actually understand how Kenjaku survived this. The reason Kenjaku survived the black hole is because he's able to swap bodies with other people and use their curse techniques. One of the bodies he swapped with is Yuji Itadori's mother, Kaori Itadori. Her curse technique involved using gravity to push objects down and make the gravity around him generally more heavier. Kenjaku used the reverse curse technique to invert this ability's effects to make gravity less strong around him, therefore allowing him to survive the gravitational pull of the black hole. This is less of a durability feat for Kenjaku, more a battle IQ feat, as he was able to think of that on the fly, in the face of such a devastating and panicking attack. So to recap and lay out the arsenals of both characters, the lowest AP for Miss Radioactive seems to be about the large city level, with the lowest speed being around the hypersonic tier. The lowest attack potency for the JJK verse is much the same, however their speed is far lower, being around subsonic plus when you lowball. When highballing both opponents, Miss Radioactive's attack potency is generally in the large country to multi-continental level, with her speed being massively faster than light. JJK, on the other hand, is more comfortably in the large island level of AP, with the absolute highball being massively faster than light or relativistic. The stats covered, we can finally put these two calamitous forces against each other and see who comes out standing over the body of the other. This Gauntlet actually starts out pretty bad for the JJK universe. Even when lowballed to her max, Miss Radioactive still gets past most of the verse pre-Culling games, and she even gets pretty far into the Culling games as well. Her AP can put her on par with and even outscale characters like Uro and Ryu, who are even giving Yuta a tough time. Meanwhile, her speed should put her above most of the verse and on par with heavy hitters like Yuta, Maki, Hikari, and Yuji, and should allow her to scrap with characters like 15-Finger Sukuna, although likely getting outsped by 20-Finger Sukuna and Gojo. Because of this, the only Culling Games factors I'll be taking into consideration in this fight are Takaba, Higuruma, Kashimo, and Yorozu. The only pre-Culling Games character I'll be putting her up against is Mahito, for reasons that will become apparent for all of them later. Despite these characters arguably being much weaker than the heavy hitters, it's their curse techniques that allow them to contend with Miss Radioactive, not necessarily their stats. Starting with Mahito, realistically Miss Radioactive should just posterize them. Her AP is far greater and her speed is far greater. There's nothing Mahito can really do to her. However, the same is true for Miss Radioactive. Mahito's curse technique, Idol Transfiguration, allows for him to change the shape of his soul and the souls of others, which subsequently reshapes their bodies. This soul shaping can be fatal and often is. Due to it attacking the soul, a non-physical object, it also completely ignores conventional durability. Because of this fact, Mahito can also not be killed with conventional attack potency, as you would need to target his actual soul to destroy him. Miss Radioactive does not have any way to do this, as she doesn't know the shape of her own soul, and thus cannot make her radiation target Mahito's. This would seem to put the fight at a stalemate, with Miss Radioactive constantly drowning Mahito in her radioactive sludge, and Mahito running around like a chicken with its head cut off trying to touch her and destroy her soul. The outcome of this fight comes down to one thing, and that's domain expansions. Once Mahito realizes that he can't actually touch this woman, he'll likely employ his domain self-embodiment of perfection. If Miss Radioactive gets caught in this domain, she gets cooked. Her soul gets reshaped and she becomes a horrific abomination for Mahito's army of transfigured humans. She just doesn't have any way out of getting her soul reshaped. If you believe, however, that Miss Radioactive can just outspeed his domain and get out of its radius before it forms, or even teleport outside of it after she's been caught in it, well then Mahito solidly loses this. This is because after a domain expansion is deployed, the sorcerer enters curse technique burnout, wherein which using their curse technique becomes nigh impossible without damaging themselves, often requiring them to use high-level reverse curse technique to recover their curse technique, which can result in heavy brain damage. Because Mahito has his curse technique disabled, he would either have to use reverse curse technique to recover it, which he cannot do without Black Flash, or he would simply just die, since he no longer has to have his soul targeted to be hurt. He can just be hurt by regular means. Even if he does recover his curse technique, it's likely going to be less potent than it was before, seeing as, he has to damage his brain. And even when recovered, he still wouldn't be able to land any hits on Miss Radioactive. So the fight would just drag on until he domain expansions again, giving Miss Radioactive another chance to kill him. Because there are probable and viable win cons for both sides, I'll be giving both sides the point, since you can argue with a fair level of certainty that Miss Radioactive would not have any counter to self-embodiment of perfection. However, you can also argue that she could get out of its range and just attack Mahito when his curse technique is burnt out. Up next we have Takaba and Higuruma, who both get destroyed. Miss Radioactive just massively outspeeds and outmuscles the two of them. The thing that makes their matchup so interesting is their unique curse techniques. Higuruma's curse technique is mostly carried by his domain, Deadly Sentencing. In this domain, the sure hit enforces a set of rules upon the target rather than an actual attack. The rules of Deadly Sentencing are that violence cannot be used and that Higuruma has to prove the guilt of the target to the Shikigami judgment. Higuruma can select any crime that the target has committed and the target can choose to either plead guilty or try to defend themselves. If the target is able to make a solid case and defend themselves, they are charged not guilty by judgment and get out of the domain. If Higuruma finds them guilty of the accused crime, they are subject to 2 punishments, either confiscation or death penalty. Confiscation essentially just takes away the curse technique and curse energy of the defendant, leaving them to battle Higuruma with straight hands. Death penalty, on the other hand, gives Higuruma a cursed tool known as the Executioner's Blade, which when piercing the defendant instantly kills them. This, however, isn't really a problem for Miss Radioactive. If she were to be caught in deadly sentencing, she'd almost surely get the death penalty, seeing the devastation she caused in both of her debut scenarios. But Miss Radioactive just massively outspeeds and outmuscles Higuruma, even when lowballed. More likely than not, she'd probably just take the Executioner's Blade out of Higuruma's hands and stab him to death with it. Takaba, on the other hand, might also meet the same fate if Miss Radioactive is just able to blitz him before he can react. However, if he can react, then things get a little dicey for Miss Radioactive. Takaba's curse technique is called the Comedian. It basically allows him to make whatever he finds funny into reality. Takaba does not find death or people getting hurt to be funny, which is what Miss Radioactive revels in, so she wouldn't be able to do anything to him while the Comedian is active. Likewise, Takaba also wouldn't really be able to do much to Miss Radioactive, seeing as his AP is just not that high and he doesn't really like to hurt people. Takaba is, as Yuta states, a good person. The reason I could see this as a win con for Takaba is because if he does trap Miss Radioactive in the Comedian, he might be able to win by pacifying Miss Radioactive. Miss Radioactive's motivation for being the person she is the fact that her parents left her to rot in the Chernobyl exclusion zone, and she wants to make the world suffer as she had to during those harsh years. If Takaba is able to, say, understand her a little bit or allow her to work through her trauma using the comedy of the curse technique, she might be inclined to either find another way to vent her trauma and go about her goals, or she might put them down entirely and just become a normal person. This is definitely the more sweet and honestly interesting outcome of this battle. However, it's less likely seeing as Miss Radioactive is just a bloodthirsty character, so she likely just blitz Takaba before he's able to react, and thus the Comedian wouldn't activate either. So I'm gonna have to give both of these W's to Miss Radioactive. However, if you believe that she can get caught in the Comedian and come out a better person, then I guess Takaba gets the W. I'm not opposed to that since I think it's really sweet. Next up, we have Kashimo and Yorozu, who are also only in the conversation because of their busted curse techniques. Normally, both of these characters get blitzed and destroyed by Miss Radioactive. In Kashimo's case, his base stats just aren't enough to keep up with her, and he gets turned into the femboy farmer the memes make him out to be. If he activates his curse technique, Mythical Beast Amber, however, things become a lot more interesting. This is because in Mythical Beast Amber, his stats are greatly increased. His curse technique involves controlling any and all electrical phenomena, and Mythical Beast Amber pushes this to the extreme. By converting his flesh into cursed energy, he can manifest electrical signals to his brain to boost his stats, produce sonic waves, and shoot out electromagnetic waves, the most important of these abilities. His stats also get a major boost, putting him pretty solidly in Massively Hypersonic Plus. This would actually allow him to keep up pretty well with Miss Radioactive, as this is her more consistent to maybe a little lowball tier of speed. The reason I find this matchup so interesting is because, like Miss Radioactive, Kashimo can control forms of radiation. EM waves are technically radiation, so my thought with this fight is, how would this react with Miss Radioactive? Would this be the one form of radiation she doesn't reign as queen over, or would it just backfire on Kashimo and show him that all radiation is a part of her kingdom? It honestly doesn't really matter that much, seeing as Mythical Beast Amber has a time limit, so if Miss Radioactive isn't able to turn the radiation on him, she can likely just stay out of his combat radius and wait out the time limit for Mythical Beast Amber, which would kill Kashimo. Quite anticlimactic, I know, especially with the glaze I was just giving Kashimo. However, despite its anticlimacticness, I just had to include it since it's one of the matchups that inspired me to make this video. Yorozu has a similar case where, without her curse technique, she just gets posterized. Her curse technique is all about constructing things from nothing but curse energy. However, it takes a lot of curse energy, and for that reason was generally considered to be a non-formidable technique. She, however, circumnavigates this by thinking outside the box and drawing inspiration from bugs in her creations to get the most practicality and usability with the least amount of curse energy expenditure, due to bugs having very streamlined anatomy, for lack of a better word. This, like Kashimo, got the gears in my head turning, because there's a bug quite notorious for being able to resist radiation, and that is the humble cockroach, the pest of almost every American household. If Yorozu could make herself a suit of roach armor, she might be able to resist some of Miss Radioactive's radiation. However, the actual pink radiation itself would probably just burn through the suit because of its high AP. There is one thing she can construct, however, that would likely just kill Miss Radioactive, and that's her perfect sphere. Perfect spheres are generally considered to be impossible since they'd had infinite points of contact, allowing them to generate infinite pressure. However, Yorozu can make them because she's just that girl. This on its own wouldn't be that formidable since Miss Radioactive could probably just get out of the way, but if she's caught in Yorozu's domain, threefold affliction, Yorozu could just make the perfect sphere her sure hit. This would mean that in the domain, Miss Radioactive is just subjected to infinite pressure at every moment, which unless you make her actually invincible, she's just not getting out of. Because I don't want to absolutely highball Miss Radioactive, I'm not going to give her that win con. Instead, I'm going to invoke the Mahito clause because it's also just as equally likely that Miss Radioactive could run out of the domain before it forms, or could teleport out of it since she just massively outspeeds Yorozu. Therefore, I'll give this win to the both of them. If you believe that Yorozu could catch Miss Radioactive in threefold affliction and subject her to the infinite pressure of her perfect sphere, then Yorozu wins this one. If you believe Miss Radioactive would just run out or teleport out, then she wins this one. Now that we've got the more special cases out of the way, we can move on to the actual meat of the video, that being the heavy hitter fights. Starting off with arguably the weakest heavy hitter, that being the restless gambler of Jujutsu High, Hikari Kenji. Hikari gets a lot of slander in the community for not really doing much, and this fight admittedly isn't going to help that. What makes Hikari such a formidable opponent and gets him past most of the verse is his insane domain, Idle Death Gamble, also known as Restless Gambler. Like Deadly Sentencing, Restless Gambler is a conditional domain where the sure hit is just a bunch of rules. The main gimmick of the domain is that if Hikari lines up all three symbols of a character from the manga Private Peer Love Train, he hits what's called the jackpot. This jackpot grants him infinite curse energy, which allows him to reflexively use reverse curse technique. This RCT is so strong that he can regenerate his stomach being shot open, limbs getting lopped off, and even his brain getting scrambled by lightning. Reime, Sukuna's right hand, has stated that this RCT is stronger than even Sukuna and Gojo's, who have the most advanced RCT in the verse, being the two strongest. So, will this do Hikari any good here, or will he just become slandered once more? Well, yeah, it would. If Hikari gets his jackpot off, well then, there's nothing Miss Radioactive can do. Melt him directly with the radiation, RCT. Give him radiation poisoning, RCT. Just say fuck it and throw hands with him, RCT. In jackpot mode, Hikari Kenji is effectively immortal. There are a few caveats to this immortality though. One is that in order to get the jackpot, Hikari has to actually trap her in the domain, which, if you believe Miss Radioactive could teleport or outspeed, wouldn't happen. Even if she does get trapped in the domain or lets herself get trapped, his jackpot mode only lasts for 4 minutes and 11 seconds. Kashimo himself realized this in his fight against Hikari but due to his warrior nature, decided it would be a loser thing to just wait it out and kill him when it runs out. Miss Radioactive, who only revels in suffering, likely would not have the same warrior mentality and would either wait out the 4 minutes of 11 seconds or just teleport outside the range of his domain so that she wouldn't get caught in it in the first place and just leave him to get killed by a bunch of radioactive slimes. Honestly, I see the second outcome being a lot more likely, and even if you say Miss Radioactive does get caught in the domain and Hikari can just spam jackpots, that doesn't really get him anywhere. His AP and speed just aren't really enough to do anything to Miss Radioactive. So if he does catch her in the domain, the fight just becomes a stalemate. And if he doesn't, he gets pretty badly defeated. Because of that, I'm going to give the win to Miss Radioactive, but if you believe that he'll just chain jackpots, then I'm not going to argue against that and just say that nobody gets the win here. Moving on to the next heavy hitter, that being Maki Zenin. I'm including Toji with Maki since both of them are heavenly restriction users, which is essentially just a bonding vow that gives up all of your cursed energy in exchange for insane physicality. And thus, they're both essentially relative. Now, depending on whether or not you want to use the lowball or consistent scaling, I think Miss Radioactive actually has a decent shot of being beaten here. If you use the lowball tier for Miss Radioactive, then her AP and speed actually get matched by Maki and Toji quite nicely. By this point in the series, JJK characters have reached that hypersonic to massively hypersonic level of speed and reaction time, as well as having that large city level AP. The thing that Maki and Toji have over Miss Radioactive is that they don't actually need to worry about her AP because of the Soul Liberation Katana, also known as the Soul Splitting Katana. This is a cursed tool that both Maki and Toji possess, with its ability being to bypass conventional durability and cut directly at a target's soul. The only way to counter this is by knowing the shape of your own soul and reinforcing it, which is something that nobody but Yuji, Sukuna, and Mahito could do, so Miss Radioactive would not be able to use this line of defense. This gets even more dangerous if we just consider Toji as a stand-in for Maki, since Toji has a cursed tool over Maki, that being the Inverted Spear of Heaven. The Inverted Spear of Heaven forcibly stops any cursed technique that it comes in contact with, and when piercing a sorcerer can just disable their cursed technique usage entirely. Since we've been treating Miss Radioactive as a curse user, meaning she possesses some cursed energy and can see cursed spirits as well as use cursed techniques, if we treat her radiation as her cursed technique, then Toji might be able to just carve through it if she tries to use the radioactive shield. If he's able to do this, then he could likely pierce her with the inverted spear, which would prevent her from producing any more radiation, which would get rid of the main problem of this fight. Heavenly restriction users do possess passive healing, however it's not necessarily as strong as, say, reverse curse technique, so radiation poisoning might actually be a problem if the fight drags. The inverted sphere gets rid of this. So with Miss Radioactive having no radiation, as well as having her durability get bypassed, as well as fighting opponents that have equal speed to her, she's in quite the bit of a pickle here. When using her lowball stats, I just genuinely don't see a way of her getting out of this. She could maybe play defense and just stay out of their range while slowly whittling them down with her radiation, but even if she tries to directly melt them, they have equal AP and durability, so it likely wouldn't one-shot them. However, this is all when we consider Miss Radioactive in her lowball tier. If we consider her in her consistent tier, well then this fight becomes a slaughter. Miss Radioactive could just outspeed the two and destroy them with her AP, or she could just cover the entire colony in radiation and leave them to get burned up, which, seeing as her AP would massively outscale them, they wouldn't be able to protect against at all. Because of this, I'm going to have to give the win pretty solidly to Miss Radioactive. If you believe that her losing in her lowballed stats should speak towards something, then you can consider this a double win, with Miss Radioactive and Maki both getting the point. Moving on to the protagonist of the series, Yuji Itadori. This fight is essentially her Mahito fight on steroids. Yuji has better durability than Mahito, greater speed than Mahito, and greater AP than Mahito. He also can target the soul with his punches, seeing as he was a vessel for Sukuna and thus knows the shape of his and other people's souls. That, and when you consider that when Miss Radioactive is lowballed, her speed should be on par with Yuji's as well as her AP and durability, Yuji actually stands a pretty good chance here. The radiation won't really be a problem, unlike with Maki and Toji, since Yuji actually possesses a pretty strong reverse curse technique. When facing a world-cutting slash, with the help of Choso, he was able to bounce back from it pretty quickly, which is something that not even Yuta, who is generally considered to be stronger than him, could do. Yuji also, due to being a vessel for Sukuna, possesses his curse technique, Shrine. The two main abilities of Shrine are Cleave and Dismantle. Cleave is essentially a slash that adjusts its strength to the target. However, because of this powerfulness, it requires the user of Cleave to make physical contact, which Yuji would not be able to do here due to Miss Radioactive's shield. If he did try to make contact, he'd likely just lose a limb, which wouldn't be much of a problem, but he can't use Cleave without touching her, so it's a non-factor. The second attack of Shrine is Dismantle, which is a slash that can be used at any range and doesn't require physical contact. However, because of this, it does not scale to the target. You have to dump cursed energy into Dismantle to make it stronger. Yuji, however, has a bit of an edge over Sukuna, as due to a binding vow, he has a special variant of Dismantle, that being his Soul Dismantle. This was done through a binding vow that allows for Yuji to cut directly at a person's soul and bypass their durability. However, because of this, he has to make physical contact to cut their soul, essentially making Dismantle a different form of Cleave. This makes this fight very dangerous for Miss Radioactive no matter what you give her durability, since even if you consider her to be completely physically invincible, she can't reinforce her soul. So if she gets hit by the soul dismantles, she's going to be in some trouble. You might be asking the question, well, why would she even need to worry about that? She has her radioactive shield, and Yuji can't touch her. Well, actually, he doesn't need to touch her, so long as he uses his domain. His domain expansion doesn't actually have a name, however it's essentially just Malevolent Shrine but cooler, since Cleave and Dismantle act as its sure hits. This means that if Miss Radioactive is caught within Yuji's domain, he doesn't actually have to touch her to use his soul dismantles. He can just send them directly at her soul and cut her to hell. Because of this, I can actually see Miss Radioactive being put down here so long as you believe that she can't get out of his domain or keep her in the lowball tier. However, her teleporting out of domains has been her pretty big get out of jail free card, so like with other fights, if you believe that that is a viable escape, I believe she can win, since Yuji would be in Curse Technique Burnout, and thus she could be able to put the pressure on him and ultimately get the W. If you think she can't teleport out of the domain, well then she just gets cut up and Yuji wins this. This fight, like Maki and Toji, also becomes a slaughter if you take her out of the lowball tier and put her in the consistent tier. So for that reason, I'll be giving both Miss Radioactive and Yuji the W here, since I think both of them can pretty consistently come away with a win if they play the fight smartly. Now we move on to the last heavy hitter of Jujutsu Kai, Yuta Okkotsu, the Cursed Prodigy. I think this is where Miss Radioactive finally starts to meet her match. The only way I can see her winning is if we just put her into the consistent tier, or if we consider the fact that she can teleport out of domains. Even if Miss Radioactive does play defense and keeps range, Yuta, unlike many of his peers, actually has a bunch of ranged attacks due to his curse technique, Copy. This, as the name implies, allows him to copy the curse technique of other people, so long as he has consumed a body part of them. Within Copy, he has 3 key abilities that will be paramount to stopping Miss Radioactive. 1. Shrine. This shrine isn't the same as Yuji's, it's essentially just Sukuna's version of Shrine, since it can't damage the soul. Despite this, Cleave is still a very deadly attack, and if he's able to get a few off on Miss Radioactive, she's going to be in trouble. The second main ability that will be useful here is Technique Extinguishment, namely Jacob's Ladder, the technique of Hannah or Angel, since they work symbiotically. Jacob's Ladder is essentially the apex technique of Technique Extinguishment, as it nullifies evil objects. And in the case of the Jujutsu Kaisen world, can destroy cursed objects, cursed spirits, or evil beings. When used against sorcerers and humans, it can temporarily extinguish their curse technique. This was seen to be effective even on high-level opponents like 20-Finger Sukuna, whom when hit with Jacob's Ladder, was so weakened that it allowed Yuji to enter Megami's soul and nearly wake him up, which would have put Sukuna out of commission. When Sukuna was at 15 fingers, it completely charred him and disabled his ability to use Cleave and Dismantle, instead having to rely on the 10 Shadows as he had just taken over Megami's body. Seeing as Miss Radioactive is hellbent on destroying the entire planet and making everybody suffer as she did in Chernobyl, it's pretty safe to say that she's evil in every sense of the word, so Jacob's Ladder would be pretty effective on her. Even if it doesn't one-shot her, she's not coming out unscathed, since her technique will be temporarily unavailable. This means Yuta will be able to pile on stuff like Shrine, as well as Sky Manipulation, Cursed Speech, and various others. This is a big problem for Miss Radioactive, seeing as since she no longer has her shield, Yuta can actually touch her and use Cleave, which, piled on top of a Jacob's Ladder, would make her have a really shitty day. Even if all else fails, he has a third important technique that he copied, that being body swapping. However, this won't really come up until the Gojo fight, so I'm not really going to cover it here. Honestly, unless you consider Miss Radioactive just outright blitzing Yuta, I don't think there's any way for Miss Radioactive to get out of this. Even if Miss Radioactive escapes the range of his domain, Jacob's Ladder is shown to be so large and vast that it covers entire city blocks, so Yuta could honestly just ad-lib it and probably still catch Miss Radioactive. Because her consistent tier speed massively outscales Yuta's though, I will have to give both of them the win, since it's not fair to say that Miss Radioactive just loses because she's at a lowballed and inconsistent tier of speed. That's not really fair at all, especially since it's heavily implied to not be her apex. Now we get into the last rings of the JJK verse, the last hope to save them from the Queen of Terror. Before we get to the strongest, I wanted to cover a few honorable mentions, that being the other special grades, Geto, /Genjaku, and Yuki. Honestly, I don't see any of the three getting past Miss Radioactive. Their scaling just doesn't hold up much, and their curse techniques aren't really going to be that much of a threat. The only threat I see is Kenjaku's domain if he uses the anti-gravity technique as a sure hit, as admittedly that is a pretty powerful sure hit and was able to put high tiers like Yuki down pretty hard. Again, however, Miss Radioactive does have the speed advantage and could just teleport out of its range. For Yuki, the only real win con I see is her pulling out the black hole, but seeing as that is a self-sacrificial move and would also destroy the world, it's not really the best win con. Maybe her gravity punches could do some damage if you lowball or put Miss Radioactive in the consistent tier, since her AP does seem to be off the charts and likely some of the highest in the verse. However, Miss Radioactive does just massively outspeed her and could just teleport and avoid her attacks. Geto is only mentioned because I mentioned Kenjaku. Geto is just Kenjaku, but worse. He doesn't use his curse technique, curse manipulation, as effectively. He also has no domain, nor any reverse curse technique, so he's susceptible to Miss Radioactive's radiation and can't even trap her in. He just gets posterized and reduced to being a stat pattern for Miss Radioactive. I just wanted to mention them because, aside from Yuta Okkotsu and Satoru Gojo, they're the two special grades of the verse, so it wouldn't really be fair to leave them out, seeing as they're technically some of the strongest. Now that they've got their very little and admittedly pretty embarrassing time in the limelight, we can move on to the actual strongest of the verse. That being the demons of Jujutsu, Satoru Gojo and Ryomen Sukuna. Starting off with Gojo, everybody knows what makes him busted at this point. His curse technique, Limitless, is basically just spatial manipulation. In the neutral application of Limitless, he can make infinity, which is what he's known for. To put it simply, infinity applies the paradox of Achilles and the tortoise to the space around him. In Achilles and the Tortoise, the Greek hero Achilles would never be able to catch up to a tortoise that started the race before him, as technically there would be an infinite distance between him and the tortoise. How does this work? Well, it works by looking at math. If you divide the number 1 in half, you just get 0.5. If you divide 0.5 in half, you get 0.25. If you divide 0.25 in half, you get 0.125, so on and so forth. No matter how much you divide it, you'll never actually reach 0. There will always be an infinite distance between 1 and 0. This is how infinity works. There will always essentially be an infinite distance between you and Gojo when passing through infinity. Unless you can move at infinite speed or can traverse a distance without actually using speed, i.e. teleportation, you'll never be able to hit Gojo. This technique is meticulous and precise too, as it works down to the atomic level, meaning that no physical attacks could ever reach Gojo. The other 3 applications of Limitless involve Curse Technique Lapse Blue, Curse Technique Reversal Red, and Imaginary Technique Hollow Purple. To explain Lapse Blue, it's essentially just a ball of gravity. It's the concept of pulling. Once generated, anything in the vicinity will be pulled towards the circle of blue. Gojo often uses this to prevent targets from escaping, as well as to amp his punches by pulling in targets with blue, as well as, actually punching at them. The force of them being pulled in, as well as the force of Gojo's punch going forward, generating an insane attack. Reversal Red is the exact opposite of this, as the name implies, that being the concept of push. Whereas blue pulls objects in, red pushes them away with extreme force. It's essentially just like a gun or something, since Gojo mostly shoots it at people and, almost immediately atomizes them with it. It's pretty fucking busted. But the apex of the Limitless comes when these 2 abilities merge, that making the imaginary technique Hollow Purple. Now, Hollow Purple has 2 different interpretations. In the manga, it's described that when red and blue come together, they create imaginary mass. If this is true, then this would essentially mean that Hollow Purple is just tachyon particles, imaginary mass, meaning that it would erase anything it comes into contact with from existence, and thus ignore conventional durability. Due to tachyon particles being imaginary particles, they'd also move faster than the speed of light. This is actually somewhat consistent, since when Gojo first uses it against Toji, him, the disaster curse behind him, and the buildings behind the disaster curse are all punctured through, leaving no trace of them behind. It's just a neat circular hole. This is seen again in the Kyoto Exchange event, as when Gojo launches a Hollow Purple at Hanami, it completely erases half of their body, leaving them on the verge of death, as well as destroying everything behind them, being so great and going so deep that it creates an entire ravine. There is, however, another interpretation of the Limitless, that being that it isn't actually just imaginary mass, it's just the forces of pull and push working together. Essentially, blue is pulling something in. Essentially, red is at the center pushing back against blue, which is trying to pull something in, sort of like how a star works, which would just rip anything that comes into contact with it to shreds. This is also shown to be pretty consistent, as when Gojo uses a 200% Hollow Purple to start his fight with Sukuna, it doesn't just erase Sukuna. It does some pretty decent damage to him, as it destroys basically the surrounding city block and burns off 2 of Sukuna's hands. He just regenerates them. He's perfectly fine afterwards. This technique is used once again during the climax of their fight, as when red and blue merge, they make unlimited Hollow Purple, which is uncontrolled by Gojo, but when it goes off, it doesn't erase Gojo or Sukuna. The only things we see being completely erased are Maharaga and the surrounding city. Sukuna, on the other hand, is just charred to hell and back, missing an arm and a leg. He's on the verge of death, but he's not outright erased from existence. Gojo, on the other hand, just has half of his face charred off and comes back relatively fine using his reverse curse technique. Because both interpretations are pretty consistent, I'll be factoring in both in this fight. So starting this fight off, Gojo just got out of the prison realm and he's done a month of training with Jujutsu High, except they're now all dead. He expects to go into his fight with Sukuna and avenge his fallen students, but oh, would you look at that, a wild Radioactive Queen has appeared. Now, I believe it would be in Gojo's character to underestimate Miss Radioactive and go up to attack her. This would be quickly punished by Miss Radioactive burning him with her radiation. Remember when I pointed out that infinity works to an atomic level? Well, radiation is subatomic. It's just waves and more comparable to light in that aspect. Because of this, it would just go straight through infinity and hurt Gojo. You think this might put Gojo out for the count, but it wouldn't. He'd actually just be able to RCT it off and be fine, as he's generated limbs before, and again, his RCT is one of the strongest in the verse, only being beaten by Hikari. Even if he doesn't just rush in to attack Miss Radioactive first, his sixth eyes can determine the curse technique of anyone it looks at, so he might be able to see that Miss Radioactive can use radiation, and thus recognize that his infinity will be useless in this fight. This would likely thrill Gojo, since for the first time in years, his infinity has been bypassed, which is a feeling he hasn't gotten since he fought Toji. So from here, what happens? Well, likely the same thing as when Gojo fought Sukuna. The two individuals would swap hands for a little bit, but since their stats are mostly relative, they'd realize nobody's getting anywhere with this. If you take the consistent tier, then Miss Radioactive should have the AP advantage, but she wouldn't necessarily have the speed advantage. However, on the more lower side of her consistent tier, she is at island level, which is the same as Gojo. So they might actually be relative even in her consistent tier. Because of this, the fight would end up going the same way as Gojo and Sukuna, that being domains eventually coming into the equation. I'm not gonna lie, unless Miss Radioactive just gets the fuck out of there, like before the domain is formed, she gets cooked. If she's even a millisecond late, she's done for. Why is she done for? Well, that's because Gojo's domain, Unlimited Void, essentially projects infinity into your brain. Infinite knowledge flows through you every second. Every feeling, every sensation, every experience, everything and anything there is to know or feel, it's all forced upon you at once. This overloads your senses and fries your brain, bypassing your durability entirely and rendering you immobile. When this domain was active for even 0.2 seconds, it stated that roughly a year's worth of information was projected into those affected. With non-sorcerers being affected so bad, it took them 6 months to fully recover. Special grade curses, on the other hand, weren't out for that long, more so around 10 to 15 seconds. Either way, this would be bad for Miss Radioactive, whether she's caught for 0.2 seconds or caught completely, since in that time she's immobile. Gojo could just start putting the pressure on her, either through straight hands or using Hollow Purple. If you believe Hollow Purple is imaginary mass and existence erasure, then no matter where you scale Miss Radioactive's durability, there's no way she's surviving it. And since she'll be paralyzed for at minimum 10 seconds, she's gonna die here. Even if you want to say that Hollow Purple isn't exactly existence erasure, well, he can just keep the domain going and completely fry Miss Radioactive's brain, leaving her a vegetable. Even if Miss Radioactive plays defense and stays out of the range of Gojo's domain so he can't activate it, it would just turn the fight into an attrition war, which Miss Radioactive is not going to win. We don't really have any endurance or stamina feats for Miss Radioactive. However, Gojo essentially has infinite stamina due to his six eyes. He's essentially able to reduce his curse energy expenditure to the point where he generates curse energy faster than he uses it, essentially giving him infinite curse energy. No matter how long this fight goes on, he's not going to run out of cursed energy. Blue, red, and purple also work at a range, so even if Miss Radioactive tries to run, he can just spam her with attacks. Even the Maki strategy of just slowly poisoning Gojo with her radiation wouldn't be viable here, since Gojo has RCT. Honestly, unless you give Miss Radioactive, say, FTL speed, which is only in her highball tier, I believe that Gojo takes this win. Likely with pretty mid to high difficulty, like his fight with Sukuna, but that's no anti-feat against Miss Radioactive. Gojo is the second strongest in the verse after all, only being put down by Sukuna. Speaking of Sukuna, let's get to him. So I'm actually going to split her fight with the King of Curses into 3 different sub-fights. That being a 20-finger Yuji Kuna, which is essentially just Sukuna in Yuji's body, but with all of the feats of his 20-finger self, a 20-finger Meguna, and just a fully reincarnated Sukuna. We've already established that Miss Radioactive, like with Gojo, should be relative in terms of speed, durability, and AP. So, like with Gojo, I could see this mimicking their fight. Except for one difference, and that's Sukuna's gonna have a really hard time. This is because, like with Gojo, Miss Radioactive's shield is going to be a problem. This mantle won't be strong enough to do any lasting damage to her if it gets through her radiation, and he can't touch her with cleave because he'd likely just lose a limb since they have relative AP. It's essentially her own form of infinity. If Sukuna wants to put her down, he's going to have to use his domain, Malevolent Shrine, so that cleave will sure hit her. This would actually be pretty bad for Miss Radioactive since, unlike Gojo, she doesn't have reverse curse technique, so while she could likely tank the attacks, it's going to catch up with her eventually. Unlike Gojo, however, her curse technique won't have gone into burnout. This means that, unlike Gojo, she could actually put pressure on Sukuna within the domain even while she's being cut to shreds. This is by filling up the domain with radiation. You might say this wouldn't work because Sukuna's barrier is open, however, if that's the case, then Miss Radioactive could just run out of it and teleport out of it. Sukuna, obviously not wanting that to happen, would likely close the barrier to his domain, so that she would have no escape. Either way, this is a double-edged sword because if he leaves it open, Miss Radioactive could escape, and if he leaves it closed, she could just begin to slowly fill it up with her radiation. If this happens, Sukuna is either going to have to hope he kills Miss Radioactive before her radiation kills him, or open the barrier and let her escape, which would force Sukuna into curse technique burnout. From here, the fight gets pretty contentious since neither really have a good way of putting each other down. Miss Radioactive's radiation might be able to put Sukuna down in the domain, but if he gets away from it, he'd definitely be able to use RCT to recover from it. Meanwhile, with Miss Radioactive, she'd likely be able to run or teleport outside of the domain in order to prevent getting hit by cleave. Even if the domain barrier is closed, Sukuna runs the risk of getting killed himself, which would bring the fight to a draw. Because of this, I actually don't know what to say about this fight. I can't really see either of them solidly winning or losing. It would be a pretty extreme diff fight if one of them did win. So unless we give Miss Radioactive, say, multi-continental or country-level AP and FTL speeds, I'm going to have to give the point to both her and Sukuna. Moving on to her fight with 20-finger Meguna, which is essentially the same as Yuji Kuna, but now with the 10 shadows. The 2 most important shadows that Sukuna is going to be using in this fight are Merge Beast Agito and Divine General Maharaga. Agito can use Roundir's ability to output positive energy, allowing the Shikigami to dispel curse techniques as well as heal the caster. Maharaga, on the other hand, can adapt to any and all phenomena. If he is hit with something or experiences something that does not destroy him in one attack, he will begin the process of adaptation. Over time, that attack will become less and less effective until it's completely null and void to him. All it takes is a single attack, but the more you attack him, the easier it is to adapt and the quicker it happens. Honestly, if Sukuna were to completely summon Maharaga in the fight, I believe that Miss Radioactive could just make a ball of radiation and melt him away in one go. But that's stupid, and we know that's not how Sukuna fights. In the fight with Gojo, we saw him manifest Maharaga's wheel to allow himself or Megami's soul to get hit by any attack and bear the process of adaptation for Maharaga. This actually makes the fight very bad for Miss Radioactive, as she'd have little or no knowledge at all of this unless Sukuna decides he wants that binding vow bonus and just explains it to her, which he likely wouldn't do. Because of this, Miss Radioactive would likely just spam him with radiation, meanwhile Sukuna would regenerate using his or Agito's RCT. This would inevitably lead to Maharaga adapting to Miss Radioactive's radiation and serving as a meat shield for Sukuna. Meanwhile, Agito could likely use its RCT to dispel any radiation, since it's technically negative energy. From here, Miss Radioactive is kind of just shit out of luck. She could kill Agito, but it wouldn't really do much, since Sukuna himself has advanced RCT. She can't kill Maharaga because by this point he'd be fully adaptive. The only way for her to win would be to either one-shot Sukuna or one-shot Maharaga, but even then that would likely just make the match a draw just like it did with Yuji Kuna. Because of this, unlike last match, I'm going to have to give the point pretty solidly to Sukuna here and say he comes away with a W. Now we get into the final battle, 4-armed, fully reincarnated Sukuna versus Miss Radioactive. This fight doesn't actually change much from the Yuji Kuna fight. He just has 4 arms, allowing him to do more hand signs as well as do chants to make his attack stronger, due to having a second mouth on his stomach. He also has 2 curse tools, Kamutoke and Hiten, but we don't really know what Hiten does. Meanwhile, Kamutoke just shoots out lightning. This is dangerous for Jujutsu High, but for Miss Radioactive, it's nothing, since when you put her in the consistent tier, she massively outspeeds even the return stroke of lightning, which is a third of the speed of light. Sukuna's extra arms also won't be a factor here because her radioactive barrier would get in the way, so he can't just manhandle her like he did with Kashima. What will be dangerous for Miss Radioactive, however, are the chants and hand signs that Sukuna can do, since this might buff his dismantle enough, effectively removing his need for cleave. If Miss Radioactive keeps to range, however, she likely wouldn't have to worry about this, and that's where this fight gets interesting. Let's say we put Miss Radioactive in her consistent or highball tier, giving her country or multi-continental AP. Hell, maybe we can even give her invincibility here. What would Sukuna have to fight her? Cleave won't work, dismantle probably won't work, especially if she's not invincible and just has high durability. And domain amplification won't really be a factor, since even if he dispels the radioactive shield, he still can't really do lasting damage to her. So what does Sukuna have? Sukuna likely realizes he can't do anything against Miss Radioactive with his base attacks, so he defaults to his domain, Malevolent Shrine. Miss Radioactive, being the cruel person that likes to taunt her prey, would likely just laugh this off and say that it tickles her and walk through it like Maharaga. Like with his fight against Maharaga, Sukuna would be shocked, but he'd also be geeked as hell, putting his hands up and charging his furnace before shooting off his divine flame arrow. Furnace is an ability I neglected to mention until now for dramatic effect. It's essentially just an arrow of fire that Sukuna can use after landing a massive number of cleave and dismantles on his opponents. You might say this makes no sense, but that's just because the English translations for his technique doesn't exactly account for the Japanese nuances, since Malevolent Shrine is more accurately translated to Emperor's Kitchen or something like that. Essentially, the idea behind it is that Sukuna fillets his food with cleave, dissects it with dismantle, and then cooks it with furnace. There is no real lowball to it, since even in a weaker form, it one-shot Jogo. Its real power, however, lies when used in Sukuna's domain. This is because, in Sukuna's domain, it leaves residuals of his cursed energy lingering in the air, allowing furnace to ignite and cause a bunch of thermobaric explosions within the barrier of his domain. And as we see in chapter 261, you wouldn't really want to be hit with that. However, Miss Radioactive, especially in her consistent and highball tiers, are stronger than anyone in the JJK verse really. So Sukuna would charge up furnace and shoot it off, causing an explosion that nearly destroys all of Shinjuku. The smoke and rubble would pile up, obscuring Sukuna's vision and masking the remains of Miss Radioactive. He might, for a second, believe he actually put her down, until either she steps out of the smoke or he senses her cursed energy. Miss Radioactive, again being the little shit she is, would probably mock the King of Curses, thanking him for warming her up since it gets pretty cold in Japan during the winter months. Sukuna from here would just be straight up geeking, just as geeked as when Yuta came back in Gojo's body. He'd likely see Gojo in Miss Radioactive, as Gojo survived everything that she did, and matter of fact, did more, seeing as he was so strong that Sukuna didn't even get the chance to use Furnace against him. All these parallels with Gojo would likely make him think about that fight, and remember what put down the strongest sorcerer of the modern era. This is where things go south for Miss Radioactive. She'd likely step forward, ready to destroy Sukuna and fuel her radioactive army, but find her forearms falling away from her biceps and her torso falling away from her waist, making her faceplant into the ground, unable to move. From here, Sukuna would stand over her, monologuing like he did against Gojo, sending her off by acknowledging her strength and stating that he'll never forget her for as long as he lives. Now, what happened here? What happened here is the world-cutting slash. This is a version of Dismantle whose target is expanded to cut the world around it, essentially cutting at space itself rather than a single target. This essentially ignores conventional durability, as if you exist in the space that Sukuna wants to cut out, you're going to get cut. Since it's not cutting you, it's cutting the world. Even if we absolutely highball Miss Radioactive's durability to invincible, she's not making it through the world cutting slash in one piece. Even if she survives, it's going to be hard for her to fight back since she generates her radiation with her hands, and Sukuna likely would have cut those off. You could argue that since Sukuna in his forearm state needs to make Chan's hand signs and point to where he wants to cut, that Miss Radioactive could dodge it. But why would she at this point? She doesn't know about the world cutting slash. For all she thinks, it'd be just another amp dismantle, which she's brushed off before. No matter what way you slice her, Miss Radioactive is, well, getting sliced, and losing to Sukuna, giving the final point to Jujutsu Kaisen. The only way I can see her winning is if you absolutely highball her to FTL or irrelevant speed, in which case she likely just blitzes Sukuna and destroys him with her higher AP. However, even then, you can highball Sukuna to relativistic or FTL with the EM wave and after image feeds. So I believe it's pretty fair to say that this is where the Radioactive Queen meets her maker. So tallying up all the points and going over every fight, we get a score of 13-9. The fights where Miss Radioactive conclusively loses are with Gojo and Sukuna. Meanwhile, everything else is more so a toss-up. Honestly, this is about how I expected things to go. Jujutsu Kaisen isn't the craziest verse, but Miss Radioactive also isn't the most powerful character in fiction. Despite that, she actually did really well here, getting through most of the culling games and struggling a bit with the heavy hitters before reaching a hard wall at the strongest, which makes sense. Gojo and Sukuna are the apex. Their techniques and the way they use them are so busted that by sheer hacks, they can beat characters they probably shouldn't be able to. Characters like Miss Radioactive that massively outscale them. Though to be honest, I was surprised at how many people even stood any semblance of a chance against her. Like I said, going into this, I kind of thought that Miss Radioactive would get washed. Then I did the power scaling for Miss Radioactive and thought, oh yeah, the JJK verse is done for. And then I reread a bit of JJK in research and realized, wow, even some of the weaker characters could likely stand a chance, like Mahito, for example. There's also, again, the potential for Takaba catching Miss Radioactive in the comedian and sort of TechnoJutsuing her, which, again, I still think would be a really cool ending, despite it being unlikely. So there we have it. That's Miss Radioactive versus Jujutsu Kaisen. I had quite a lot of fun making this video, despite how many times I had to re-record it in a sweltering hot car. It's been one I've been wanting to make for a while, and unfortunately, due to a lot of circumstances, hasn't been able to come out for damn near a whole year. The script was finished back in mid to late October, but again, I wasn't able to get it out because, shit happened. Still though, I'm glad it's finally out now, and I hope you enjoyed watching it just as much as I did making it. If you want to see more content like this in the future, leave a like and drop a comment down below telling me that's exactly what you want to see, since I'm likely going to make more in the near future. I'll likely do a video specifically dedicated to scaling Miss Radioactive, since I wouldn't want to have to waste time for it in other versus battles, since it admittedly did take up a lot of time in this video. But other than that, that's all I have to say about this.